Hi, I'm Melissa. It's really fun for me to be here with you this week in the Living Spring Studios doing the online teaching. I know that you've been in the Gospel of John for the last 25 weeks with our teaching team, and it's crazy that I get to come in this chapter of all chapters. So bless Doug for letting me take this week. We're in town for the week. This was our church home for 7 years, and even though we've been away for 4 years, it still feels like home. And it's really a privilege to come and be part of what God's doing through the church in this way, through this medium today. So we're in John 20. This is really the high point of the story, of the whole Gospel of John and of our faith. This is Easter morning. The tomb is empty. Jesus is risen. Early in the morning, in the dark of pre-dawn, Mary goes to the tomb, finds it empty, runs back to Peter and John, tells them. They run to see it for themselves, go back home. Mary, who has run back with them, stays, is met by angels, and for her patience is rewarded, is met by Jesus herself. Mary is the first eyewitness to resurrection. It's a beautiful moment. She goes to tell the disciples, and that night the disciples are gathered behind locked doors. It's the first evening of the first day of the new world, as Darrell Johnson says. And Jesus appears among them. He speaks peace. He breathes a measure of the Holy Spirit on them, and then he's gone. And our passage begins here. So I'm going to read from John 20, verses 24 to 31. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Let's begin with Thomas. There's a lot here, even though this isn't the typical place that I think, if you get 1 week in John 20, I imagined we'd be staying in the garden, but I found my attention drawn here. If the garden, the resurrection, is the high point in the life of the church, and it is. This is, as Paul says, if not for the resurrection, we're to be pitied more than all men. If the resurrection isn't real, if Christ is not risen from the dead, then our hope, our faith means nothing. The resurrection makes it all make sense. It pulls it all together. But as I sat in the chapter, my attention was really drawn to this exchange with Thomas and what it means for us. The way that Jesus meets us in the tension of knowing the miracle, having heard it for ourselves, but the gap between what we hear to be true and our own experience, what happens in that gap, and how Jesus meets us. So that's where we're going to sit. So let's begin with Thomas and his response when he hears the excited report of the disciples, who were his friends, his fellow apprentices. They've experienced what his experience tells them is not possible. Maybe Thomas had a scientific mind. Science demands a precedent or a way to isolate variables and repeat a set of circumstances in order to produce a certain outcome. There was no precedent for the kind of resurrection that Jesus had experienced. His was the first of the eventual resurrection of all, a resurrection unto a new world, a new kind of body, similar to his earthly one, but different. His body had scars, recognizable scars. It bore the marks of his life on earth. His body could eat, but also it could get through locked doors. It could appear and disappear. It could be disguised and then revealed. And Thomas refuses to believe a story based purely on the experience of others. He wants to touch the risen body of Jesus for himself. Now, Thomas has gotten a bad rap, right? His story is the historical basis for the designation of a doubting Thomas, which is not a compliment generally. This is usually refers to an outlier who's dubious of the success of a proposed plan or mission. But the couple of other glimpses that the Gospel of John anyway gives us into Thomas's character reveal a different picture. They show him, to be a man maybe of a different kind of character than that. So if we look at John 11, verse 1 to 16, this is the story of Jesus hearing that Lazarus is unwell and saying, we're going to go and be with him, but delaying the time there. And then someone comes and tells him that actually Lazarus is gone. Like, don't worry about it. You're not going to make it in time. And Jesus tells his disciples, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, called Didymus, says to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. This is not a man of fickle commitment. This is not someone who's going to jump at the first sign of trouble. In John 14:15, in the upper room discourse, and Jesus is telling his disciples, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I'm going to come back and bring you to be with me. You know the way to the place where I am going. And Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going. So how can we know the way? And he's not trying to figure out, like, do I really want to do this? He wants to know how to go where Jesus is going. But he says, look, you haven't told us. How do we know how to get there? This is a man who wants to follow Jesus. He's got strong commitment. There's other characters. There's other disciples in our story who make big boasts and don't live up to it. And that's not Thomas. We begin to get a picture of someone who's really steadfast, actually, really faithful. Someone who's committed to following this rabbi right to the end, right to death and Golgotha. Maybe he's watching from the crowd as Jesus breathes his last, and maybe that just crushed his hope. His own eyes told him it was over. And maybe the crushing loss of that mission was just too much to bear. Maybe the grief of missing his teacher, his friend, of seeing the one he had come to believe was Messiah tortured and killed was too precious a grief to let go of just based on what someone else had said. His experience told him people don't rise from the dead after 3 days. He'd seen Lazarus, but this was different. Maybe Thomas was so committed to the faith he had in who Jesus was that he couldn't let go of that based on evidence that did not fit his realm of experience. Sometimes the church hasn't been a safe space for questions and for doubt. And why is that? What is it about someone's doubt or questions when they're questioning the faith that we have, experiences that we've had? What is that makes us so uncomfortable? Because a lot of people have been kicked out of churches and faith communities for just voicing their questions and their doubts. One of the things I love about this church is that it's a place that has welcomed questions and that you are led by a leadership team who's not afraid to wrestle with the questions themselves. And you have witnessed the ability to debate and disagree with each other and to see things from different views and to find a unity of love and a unity on the first things of our faith that makes space for these kind of questions. I love that about this church community. What is doubt? The basic dictionary definition is that doubt is a lack of conviction or a feeling of uncertainty. Sometimes that looks like questioning things we've always taken for granted. Sometimes new evidence comes forth and we have to reevaluate a previous understanding or belief that we had. Without doubt, we would still think the world is flat. Doubt can be the other side of a desire to believe what is true, to be aligned with reality. So committed to being aligned with reality that we don't want to believe something that just seems totally out of sync with the reality that we know. To be an atheist is to disbelieve or to lack any belief in a divine being. It's a rejection of belief in God. But doubt is different. It's an uncomfortable place of tension, of not knowing what to believe and not being able to give full assent. Why do we doubt? We can speculate about why Thomas doubted, but when we think about from our own human experience, why do we doubt? I mean, there's lots of possibilities. Perhaps our existing understanding of something, our existing understanding of God just doesn't make sense alongside some new data that we're presented with. And rather than risk the discomfort of letting go of our entire view of God, or letting our view of God expand and shift in a way that feels scary, we doubt the new data. We're unwilling to let go of what we know or what's comfortable. Doubt, I think, can be the result of a fear of looking foolish. If the belief that we're invited to give assent to turns out to be false, to be wrong. I think sometimes our identity or our sense of worth can be tied into being right or being well thought of. And the risk of being wrong, therefore, feels like too deeply personal. It feels like a threat to our whole sense of worth or of being. So we stay in the place of doubt, or we doubt that belief and stick with what we feel we can know with certainty. I wonder too if sometimes doubt is the result of the fear of losing control. To doubt feels safer than to give up full control. Ultimately, to believe is to take some things on faith. To actually structure our lives and our values by something we can't fully see, and to trust and believe someone we haven't seen is to give up control. I mean, because to believe in Jesus means to accept that he is fully God, fully human, the author of life, the ultimate authority on how to live, and it's therefore to follow him, to accept his direction, to live by his wisdom, and that requires a surrendering of control, to say that Jesus, your wisdom gets to come before mine. You get to trump me, ultimately. I want to learn from and submit my understanding to you. So it requires a surrendering of control. And if early childhood experiences or later life trauma make feeling out of control a terrifying experience, your entire nervous system might stand up in arms at the thought of giving full belief or assent to something that you can't see, can't touch, can't control. Whatever our reasons for doubt, let's look at how Jesus meets Thomas in his. In verse 26. A week later, the disciples are in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Jesus comes to Thomas in his confusion, his uncertainty, in the fear that he shares with the other disciples. They are in hiding because their leader, who they were really clearly associated with, was arrested and brutally murdered in public. So they're hiding. They're in real fear. Jesus comes to Thomas with the other disciples and speaks peace. Into Thomas's doubt and all the different reasons there might have been for that uncertainty, the unwillingness to believe what he had heard, Jesus comes and just speaks peace. Thomas, shalom. The incarnate word speaks peace. And I imagine that just as that storm one night on the Sea of Galilee came to a dead calm as Jesus stood up and spoke, "Peace, be still," I wonder if into the storm of fear and uncertainty and confusion in Thomas's own heart, Jesus coming and standing in the midst of them and just speaking, "Peace be with you," just like regulated everyone's nervous system, just calmed everybody. Thomas too. And in that moment of calm, Jesus turns right to Thomas and meets him, directs his gaze, his voice to him, doesn't ignore him, doesn't berate him, but turns that gaze of compassion and love and peace directly to Thomas and says, "I understand your need for personal experience. I understand the seriousness of your faith and how seriously you are taking this. And here I am. Touch me. Put your hand here. Put your finger here. He meets Thomas with peace. He directs his personal gaze to him. He meets him with, there's a personal encounter. In the midst of that room, Jesus has his eyes locked into Thomas. He invites Thomas to touch him. And then the invitation, the call. Stop doubting and believe. Move from the darkness of doubt into the light of faith. Why does Jesus want Thomas to believe? We could ask, what does he have for Thomas? It's not just about fitting into the majority and sorting out, tensions in this confused, slightly freaked out early group of disciples. Jesus has something for Thomas. Now, it's always better to live in reality than unreality. Yes, because that's where Jesus is. That's the present moment. We can't live in the past. We can't live in the future, right? We are in this moment. God is here. This is where we're called to live. And in reality, Jesus, having risen, has changed everything. And Jesus is inviting Thomas to live in the new reality that his resurrection has ushered in. But belief has also been a theme in Jesus' interactions with people and his teachings throughout the Gospel of John. If you look through the Gospel of John, this is one of the things I love about it. We don't see a lot about sin and guilt. Jesus isn't talking to people about their shame. He's not talking about having your sins dealt with and cleaning up your life and acting right. When you hear Jesus talk, one of the main themes is life. The gospel is about life, that God is a God of life, and he's come to give us our life back in Jesus. And Jesus is here to show us the way to the life that is truly life, what it means to really live. It's being given back our God-created ability to say yes to God and to lay our lives down in love for others, in the image of God, as we were meant to. The gospel is about life. But Jesus also has a lot to say about belief. I'm going to read just a few passages that help us see this together. So John 6:29, Jesus answers, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." John 10:24-28, they're at the Feast of Dedication at Jerusalem. The Jews gathered around Jesus saying, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you're the Christ, tell us plainly." And Jesus answered, "I did tell you, but you do not believe. The miracles I do in my Father's name speak for me, but you do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they shall never perish." John 11, again, that passage where he's anticipating Lazarus's, what he's going to do for Lazarus. And he says, "For your sake, I'm glad I'm not there so that you may believe." And later in that same passage, Jesus is speaking to Martha on the road before he goes to the tomb. And he says to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? John 11, again, a little bit later in the same story, verse 40-44, Jesus says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And again, there's a foretaste there of what Mary encounters in our chapter, in chapter 20, when she comes and the disciples look in and they see the cloth, the strips, the burial strips, and the face cloth lying in the tomb. Jesus is gone. In John 12, verse 37-46. Even after Jesus had done all these miraculous signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. So we see that even when we see the miracles, seeing the miracle is not always a guarantee of belief. It's not always enough to pull us from doubt to faith. Yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him. Then Jesus cried out in a synagogue, "When a man believes in me, he does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. When he looks at me, he sees the one who sent me. I have come into the world as a light so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness." And John 16, this is his last conversation with his disciples. He's in the upper room. And he's getting to the end right before he prays for them. This is the end of his teaching time. And he says, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and entered the world. Now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father. Then Jesus' disciples said, now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and you do not even need anyone to ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. You believe at last, Jesus answers. But a time is coming and has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things, everything that's come before. The main goal of Jesus' ministry with his disciples, of doing the miraculous signs and helping them understand laterally what he had done, why it mattered, explaining the parables, the whole reason he's saying, I've told you all these things so that you may believe that I come from the Father, right? That's what they finally believed at last, that he was the long-awaited Savior of the world, sent from God to show us what God is really like. Jesus is, you believe at last. Listen, I have told you these things so that you may have peace. Belief is in order to peace for Jesus. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world. Jesus wants to give Thomas peace. Peace in the current storm of his confusion and fear and doubt. But peace for the road ahead. Because life is difficult. Life is hard. Trouble is coming. But Jesus has told us all these things. He wants us to believe that he is the one sent from God, so that we may have peace in the face of all that comes, whatever comes. Belief is the doorway to peace. Jesus' resurrection changes everything. It's the ultimate miraculous sign by which God is declaring that he has come among us and broken the power of death. John counts signs through his gospel. This was the first sign that Jesus performed, and his disciples put their faith in him. In that, as John is counting, there's 6 up to the resurrection. And with Jesus' own resurrection, this is the 7th and final sign that he is who he says he is, that this is God in the flesh. And in biblical the biblical sort of numerology, the significance of number 7 represents completion, perfect, fullness. Jesus' own resurrection is the capstone of his miraculous deeds, the ultimate sign by which God is declaring that he has come among us and broken the power of death. And there is nothing that can separate us from his love. To believe that Jesus is the embodied presence of God, sent from God in words and gestures that we could understand, is to step into the life that is truly life. It's to realize that we are living in a new world. A new reality has begun. And it's to believe that we are loved and welcomed close to God just as we are, the way that Thomas was. That we are invited to spend our lives like the disciples, like Thomas, learning who Jesus is and living as he did. The moment we declare with Thomas our belief that Jesus is Lord and God, we don't understand everything. But we say yes to going on the journey, to understanding the story that we are now part of and to living in that story. To believe in what we cannot see is a risk, but we all take calculated risks every day. Most of you drive during the week. You might even drive on the Deerfoot most weeks. You get in an airplane. You believe that the young person who just picked their nose washed their hands before they assembled your Big Mac. We all take calculated risks every day. There are a lot of stories out there that offer an explanation for life. What does it all mean anyway? This is what sets us apart from other animals in creation. Humans are meaning makers. We are wired to seek understanding, to see significance. And there are a lot of other stories that try and give an explanation for what we're doing, what this is all about anyway. Some of them without God, some with gods I would not want to meet on a street corner. Not many of these worldviews or these stories that explain what's really going on, have as much historically attested first-hand accounts and corroborated testimonies as the story of Jesus, who brought from within the Jewish faith an invitation to a new world, a new life for all people. Apologetics is like not my strong point. I haven't spent ages studying it. But historians, secular scholars, look at the historical attestations, the first manuscripts, the multiplicity of accounts written about this man named Jesus from a variety of different sources, and say, without a doubt, historically, a man named Jesus, Jewish carpenter from Nazareth, lived, did some things that were inexplicable, were miraculous, was a good man, was kind and gentle, followed this way of kindness and love and peace. He was a man of peace, and he died, and there is historical attestation that the tomb was empty and the body was never found. No one could explain what happened. But there are all these agreeing first-hand accounts that people encountered this man Jesus after that death in the empty tomb, and these are the explanations they gave. So we have these accounts of others. We have this information. Information on its own is not enough. When I think about the story of Thomas and the room that Jesus makes for his doubt, for his questions, and the room that we need to make in our faith communities for questions, for doubt, for people to wrestle through periods of uncertainty or lack of conviction. I think doubt is not a bad place to visit, but it is not a place that Jesus wants us to stay. Jesus wants to encounter us in the crux of our doubt, in the place, the reason that we are having a hard time believing. He wants to meet us there and call us to belief. Not for another notch in his belt or a feather in his cap, but because he wants us to live in reality, and he wants to give us a gift that is going to help us walk through the rest of life. Why does Jesus want us to believe in him, to trust? Jesus says to Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Blessed are you who have not seen at the proximity Thomas had access to, the risen Jesus, and yet believe the stories, believe the accounts." As we read in that passage in John 16, in that upper room there, Jesus says, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace, because the world is full of trouble." And Jesus wants us to know the truth, that we are loved, that if Jesus is real, and if he is risen, then there is a living God who is moving all of history in a linear movement towards a sure end, that life has the last word. He wants us to know that God has come so close in Jesus in order to bring us into union with himself, that we are in Jesus, and Jesus is in the Father, and the Father is in him, that in Jesus we have been brought into the very heart of God. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, Paul testifies in Romans 8, nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Some of us aren't alive very long before we become acutely aware that there is a world of sorrow and pain out there. And some of us are not alive very long before the out there becomes in here, and we feel it. There's that saying, there's two certainties in life, death and taxes. Change also, right? Change is the one constant. Suffering is just going to be part of life in this world. And Jesus tells us that really plainly. There's no discipleship, there's no call to follow Jesus that doesn't involve suffering, because there's no call to human life that doesn't involve suffering. But Jesus offers us the transforming perspective of knowing that our innermost being can move through the inevitable trouble of the world without being crushed. How? If you think, what is the most incomprehensible pain that you can imagine? Is it a fatal diagnosis? A parent's abandonment? A spouse's betrayal? Genocide? divorce, crushing loneliness, a failure of your company, loss of job or home, a paralyzing economy, a lack of hope that you'll ever be able to live on your own, nevertheless, never support a family or just kind of make it with the way the economy is going. What comes to your mind when you think of the worst possible pain? Even in the midst of that, Jesus offers us, through faith in him, a kind of peace that doesn't make sense in the old order of things, but is based purely on the truth that in Jesus, we are now unshakably held. Nothing can snatch us out of the hand of God. We are not alone. That there is no pain that you are alone in. There is no pain that can separate you from the heart of God or from the power of God. The power of God may not manifest itself the way that we expect it. But it's real and it's at work in this world, and it is moving all things toward a time when goodbyes and sickness and death and hopelessness are gone. God is not impassive or distant. He is not unfamiliar with suffering. He is a Savior who comes with the marks in his hands and the wound in his side and meets us in our place of questioning and says, touch me. See, I have suffered with you. I'm hurting with you, and I am here with you in this. I'm encountering you in this, and I am with you. Look at me and trust me, and we will do this together. Brian Zond, in his book, When Everything's on Fire, says that the faith that will survive this current age in society, in the church, in this sort of era of deconstruction when a lot of people don't reconstruct, when a lot of people have lost faith in institutional leadership. The faith that will survive, also this information age, this information saturated era, the faith that will survive will be a mystical faith. What does he mean by that? It will be a faith based on a personal experience of the living God that we cannot explain away. That no one else can challenge or explain either, that we could not necessarily explain, but we know it because we experienced it. Faith in Jesus is not just about knowing a bunch of historical attestations or saying yes to a bunch of doctrines. It is this invitation to believe in and trust and walk with the risen Jesus, who miraculously by his Spirit is knowable to each one of us and wants to lead each of us on a journey. And so ultimately, the invitation to Christian faith is an invitation to an experiential knowing. Jesus doesn't actually expect us to believe purely based on the stories of others. He wants us to come to him and to ask for a personal revelation of him. You may not have any desire to see the wounded, naked side of the risen Jesus. But is there not, at the heart of where you are struggling to believe Jesus right now, is there not a need, a desire for Jesus to show up in a way that you can understand? And to say that he sees you right where you are. Ultimately, we believe anything because we have come to know in some kind of a way that something is true, is real. Did you know that you can ask Jesus for an experience of him? Many of us experience doubt from time to time. We need anchoring experiences. Maybe it is just one mystical experience, one divine encounter that we know happened, and we can hang our hat on that experience of faith for the rest of our lives and live by faith without sight for the rest. Many of the saints through the ages talk about these kind of experiences, talk about a dark night of the soul because they have known and experienced God. They hang on. I had a moment, and I want to share with you a story when I was struggling to believe. I was struggling with doubt or belief on a certain truth about God. I was in my early 20s and really growing. I think I was 15, 16 when my head belief in God became a heart response. Or the heart response of love that had been growing for 2 or 3 years became this: God, you have my life. I want to follow you. Whatever you want to do with me, my life is yours. Was I preparing? Now, I don't think I hadn't yet felt a call to ministry into Bible college, but I was working at a summer camp. And the thing that I was really struggling with was the doctrine of the Trinity. My dad gave me the basics in my faith, but he was raised in a part of Seventh-day Adventism that didn't believe in the Trinity. And he really believed that this was like a heretical thing, that we had the Father, and Jesus was the Son of God, but he was not fully God. Not quite sure what he did with the Holy Spirit. But this was like, my dad was being the sort of the authority and faith, and like our home was a big deal for him. And me starting to wrestle and question this was causing some tension in our relationship. And he was like, Melissa, if you accept my authority, then you need to trust me. This is a wrong belief. And yet I was being influenced, and my life was being spoken into by pastors and other young adults in the church, in a young adult group, in the camping ministry, who were saying, actually, the Trinity is sort of like kind of core to our faith. It's really important. And you just kind of have to accept it. And I remember saying to this guy, Brad, can you just explain it to me then? And he's like, no, I can't actually. But you've got to accept this. This is sort of core to Christian faith. And so I was wrestling with this that fall after the summer. I was down in White Rock. I was house cleaning, and I had a bus from Surrey to White Rock. And I got there early, and I had like half an hour to kill. And I just walked along the beach. The tide was out. And I remember walking along, and I took a stick. There was like just like kilometers of untouched smooth sand. And I started just writing the I am statements of John. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the living water. And I am the good shepherd. I am the gate. And somewhere in the midst of my writing these things out in the sand, I just saw that I am. And I had this mystical experience where I cannot even explain to you what happened, but I had this profound sense that God was just speaking to my spirit, saying, Jesus is claiming the divine name, that the divinity of Jesus here, the full godness of Jesus is here. It's right here in this text, in these stories, and my heart was just able to accept it. There was this spirit-to-spirit connection, and I began to, that was settled for me. I had a peace about that. It was a couple years later in Bible college, I was in a chapel, and the chapel speaker, the professor, was explaining the Trinity from that perspective of John 14, where Jesus says, if anyone loves me, I will come to him and make my home with him. If you are in, you will know that you are in me, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. And this oneness that comes, that somehow the Trinity is so important, a concept so vital for our faith, because it helps us understand that God is this community of love that we are brought into, we are welcomed into. It helps us understand that we are, God was complete in himself. He didn't need us, but it was this extra, this outpouring of his love and this desire to welcome others into his love that is the whole reason that we were here. There's so many things about the Trinity that I now, that just like boggle my mind with the beauty and the wonder of it, but I still cannot explain it. My daughter, who is almost 5, is like, Mom, but if Jesus is God, how is God his Father? Like, that's a great question, honey. I am not going to explain this to you on the way to school. But there was this mystical moment where a tentative faith that I was struggling to understand, God met me. And there have been moments like that in life where I have, they've been in conferences and church services, once on a dark sidewalk in Vancouver, where I had an encounter with God that I know that the risen God met me there and spoke to me. But life is still difficult. And when I think, where am I struggling to believe Jesus today? There are things that come to mind, even with these experiences. I've said to God, you have my life for life. You have shown me enough. I've had enough of these encounters that I will follow you for the rest of my life, no matter what happens. But that doesn't mean that day to day, some of the tensions and struggles that I experience don't come down to ultimately an unconscious uncertainty about the true things that Jesus has said about himself and about me. Where are you struggling to believe Jesus today? Where do you struggle to believe in the grittiness of your life that Jesus sees you, he knows you, and he is able to come and encounter you there and speak the word of peace that will enable you to ride through that storm, ride through that difficulty, knowing that you are as held as a baby with his mama? John records the story of Thomas's doubt and of his need for a personal experience of Jesus, so that we might know too that we are loved even in our doubts. And the risen Jesus wants to meet us right where we really need him. Our God is a God who reveals himself. He is a God of revelation. In Jeremiah, he says, "Call to me, and I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." He's a God who wants to speak to us, who wants to meet us. No matter where you are at in the journey of faith, Jesus sees you, and he speaks peace. My invitation to you is to ask him to reveal himself to you in the way that you need him to reveal himself to you, in a way that you can understand. Let's say that. Part of the humility of understanding that when we ask this, we are speaking to the God of the universe. It would be cool if we could have the humility to say, God, this is what I'm struggling to believe. Would you meet me in the way that I can understand, in a way that speaks to the deep need of my heart, and then have the humility to wait and to be open to how the living Jesus would reveal himself to you. Let encounter with Jesus move you from doubt to the blessed peace of believing. Bless you.